the Juneau World Affairs Council presents Off the Beaten Path, the impact of tourism on the indigenous population of Costa Rica, with Scott Carrlee. Carrlee is Curator of Alaska Museum Services and an experienced museum conservator. He was in Costa Rica researching the country as part of a doctoral program on international development.
Hi, thank you all for coming. I appreciate everybody making it out here with all the snow and everything. Maybe this will be the tonic that we all need for, for some winter weather that's coming. I appreciate everybody's interest in Costa Rica. I know that Alaska Airlines has recently started flying there this month, actually. So they fly to 2 locations now in Costa Rica. So it's an opportunity for all of us to be able to travel down there. I was lucky enough to be there for most of the month of May this year on a doctoral program. We were doing a research abroad. What I'd like to talk to you about today, the talk is going to be kind of 2 parts. The first part will be a bit of a travel log and some information about Costa Rica itself for those of you who are interested and have come kind of to learn about Costa Rica. And the second half of the talk will be about my particular area of interest and the research that I did down there with some colleagues of mine. We were looking at the impact of tourism on the indigenous people of Costa Rica. And the findings that I'll talk to you about are just preliminary. We're in the middle of writing up a lot of the research and analyzing the recorded interviews that we did. So this is the group of travelers that were down there. These are all doctoral students from the University of Southern Mississippi in international development. And it was a great group. It was quite diverse. We had a lot of different people from different backgrounds, also from different countries. And the main areas of research that we were doing were political, economic, and cultural research, social cultural research. So my area of research was more in the social cultural area. So here's a map of Costa Rica. You can see that it's sandwiched between Nicaragua to the north and Panama to the south. And the red dots represent all the places that we went in about a 2.5-week period. So we really covered almost the entire country, almost everywhere that you can easily get to by road. And as I mentioned, the Alaska Airlines is flying into Liberia. It's flying into 2 locations. One is Liberia, which is a small town, but they built a big airport there. And that gives you access to this whole coastal region, which is some terrific beaches along there if you want to have a beach vacation. The other airport and the other place that they're flying into is San Jose, which is a large, typically large, multi-million inhabitant city. And it takes you a little while longer, but if you're interested in some beaches, these are some of the older resorts, some of the more developed areas along here that you can access from there. We also spent time on the Caribbean side in the port of Limon. It's one of the largest ports in the Caribbean, and all of the bananas that come to us from Costa Rica, they all come through this port. This is a large banana plantation area. And we went down here to this area to the south, and some of the slides that I'll be showing you from the Bree Indian territory or native or indigenous territory are from this area. We also spent some time in the Baruca indigenous area, which is there, and in the Nobe, which is down here on the Osa Peninsula. The Osa Peninsula is a very large reserve that is quite pristine forest, quite pristine cloud forest and rainforest. And then up in this area, there is actually right over here, there's the Arenal volcano, which I'll show you a picture of, and some other touristy areas here, and that is the Maluku indigenous territories up in that area. So we did cover quite a bit of the state, or the country. And what Costa Rica is, as I mentioned, is really known for its lovely beaches. They're quite nice beaches, nice water, warm water, a lot like Hawaii, for example. And the central part of the country is fairly arid. Once all the water kind of deposits in the higher areas or along the coast, it's quite arid in the central, what they call the central plain, the central uplift of Costa Rica. This is a picture of the Guanacaste tree, which is a national tree of Costa Rica. It's quite a lovely tree that's known for throwing out, being wider than it is tall. So that's why it's very typical when you see it along the side of the road. This is another picture from up high in the mountains overlooking the northern Pacific coast of Costa Rica. It's quite beautiful, and as you can see, some areas appear quite arid. And as I mentioned before, the Arenal volcano, very famous tourist area, tourist site all around the Arenal volcano. You get lovely pictures of it when it isn't in the clouds. Unfortunately, when we were there, it was all in the clouds. That's why you're getting a Creative Commons photo of it and not my own photo of it. But this is my own photo of a lovely waterfall. There are waterfalls, quite a few waterfalls around Costa Rica, and this is known as one of the lovelier ones. And what I really enjoyed is when no matter where you are, whether you're in some hotel garden area or in the jungle itself, is the amazing flowers that you see there and orchids. They're just really spectacular, and they just grow everywhere. So I really enjoyed taking pictures of a lot of these orchids and thinking about how nature tries to produce all these very appealing, colorful shapes so that the hummingbirds will come and drink the nectar from these flowers. And what's interesting is it's the same types of hummingbirds. These are ruby-throated hummingbirds. The same types of hummingbirds that are down there they migrate up to Alaska, as you may know. And I finally got an answer from one of our tour guides, biologist, why would a hummingbird, when you're down in Costa Rica and there's all these lovely flowers everywhere, why would they bother to fly 5,000 miles up to Alaska? And that just never really made sense to me. But the way she explained it is that there's a lot of lovely flowers down there, but there's also a lot of competition, and also there are a lot of predators down there that we don't have up here. So there's lots of snakes and iguanas and things that steal their eggs from the nests. So a lot less competition once they lay their eggs. And so she felt like was one of the primary reasons why they would come up here. But I mentioned iguanas, so you can see them running around in the wild. All these pictures of nature are ones that I just took on my iPhone when we were down there. So you can get up close and personal with a lot of wildlife that's in Costa Rica. I don't know how well you can see this, but this is a white-headed capuchin monkey in a tree, and we saw many of them in the wild in the various parks in Costa Rica. There's also scorpion, vipers, and poison dart frogs. So there are many things that can kill you in Costa Rica. Not Puerto Rico, Costa Rica. Many things that can kill you there. The poison dart frog is aptly named because they used to use the secretions from the skin to put on their darts. And this is an eyelash viper, and we saw probably 3 or 4 of these on one trip through a national park. So they're quite prevalent. And then, of course, scorpions. They say that the scorpions are not that dangerous down there, that they're pretty much the same as a wasp sting, but I didn't want to try it out. So, and this, I don't know if you can see, but there's a snake that I like to call the bejesus snake because it scared the bejesus out of me when I about stepped on it. So there are many creatures that we don't have up here in Alaska. So, but I wanted to give you a few facts about Costa Rica, sorry, to kind of put you to understanding how they're doing kind of economically. The per capita income or per capita GDP, so that's the GDP divided by the number of people, is about $15,000 in 2015, considered by PPE, and PPE is purchasing power parity is what that is. And so that gives you an idea of what $15,000 would purchase there or would purchase here are about the same. So they're not doing too poorly. Their main exports, their main cash exports are bananas, pineapple, and coffee. Those are things that we might think about when we think about Costa Rica. And those amount to about 7% of their GDP, gross domestic product. There are some international companies that have made direct foreign investments there. Intel, for example, built a very large plant there producing microchips. And Procter & Gamble is there, and GlaxoSmithKline is also there. Intel has since moved their production to Asia, but they're still using their facilities down there for research and development. So it's a bit of a tech boom down there. The tourism is very large in Costa Rica, as I mentioned. There are about 2.2 million visitors, foreign visitors to Costa Rica every year, and tourism amounts to about 5% of their gross domestic product. So it's kind of big. And from a social political standpoint, it's one of the most stable democracies in Latin America. It's been a democracy since around 1948, 1949, and that puts it in as one of the most stable, continuous democracies in Latin America. And the interesting part is that they abolished their military around that time too. In 1949, the revolutionary Jose Figueres, once he kind of threw out the regime that was there, he declared it a non-military country. And my favorite anecdote about that time, because I work at the Alaska State Museum, so he was evidently a fan of museums, and he went to the garrison in San Jose, the capital, and he took a sledgehammer and knocked down the wall, one of the walls of the garrison, and said, "I will build a museum here instead of a military garrison." So the National Museum in Costa Rica is actually built on that site because of Jose Figueres. So what they did with that money, what did they do with the money that they aren't spending on the military? They made it directly into their education, the amount of money they spend on education. So it's universal public education to the 11th grade, and they have a 96% literacy rate. So you can do a lot when you don't spend all your money on the military. They also have universal health care, and the life expectancy in Costa Rica is higher than the life expectancy in the United States. So those are some high points, some good points about their social political situation. The environment, 25% of the land in Costa Rica is in some sort of national park or protected area or even an indigenous territorial area. So it's quite a bit of the land is protected. They have managed to reduce the deforestation rate to almost zero, depending on how people are looking at it and how you want to make that claim. But it's definitely, they've slowed it down to nearly zero. And they have a process there called Payment for Environmental Services, PES, and that is where they actually pay farmers not to cut down trees. And they try and make it worth their while not to cut down trees. So they really have a feeling there of that all trees should remain standing unless there's some overwhelming reason to cut them down. And we even talked to several farmers on our trip there, and they all were very protective of their trees, and they would go out of their way not to cut them down. So that's a very positive thing. And in 2015, they get 93% of their energy from renewable sources. And those sources are primarily solar, wind power. We saw several wind power generating stations. And they do a lot of geothermal around that volcano, the Arenal volcano, that's a very active geothermal sites. They also have nice geothermal hot springs there as well, so for very touristy things, it's nice. Their goal is to be 100% carbon neutral by 2021, so they're very environmentally conscious there. And some of the later on talk, I'll be talking about how tourism is trying to be carbon neutral as well. In fact, some of the brochures that you get, it says it's right on it, this is a carbon neutral tour, you know, and they'll even explain how they're making it a carbon neutral tour. So weather-wise, you can see that we go from about a balmy 81 degrees in January to a balmy 81 degrees in July. And as a matter of fact, it's a balmy 81 degrees almost, balmy 80 degrees almost straight across. So the weather doesn't change that much. They're between 8 and 15 degrees above the equator, so it's quite a stable climate that doesn't change. They do have a rainy season that occurs kind of in sort of late May, June, July, and even into August. We were there throughout the month of May, and it did rain a few times, but it goes from maybe, you know, a few inches of rain in May to 20, 30 inches of rain in June, July. So it is a very tropical rainy season during that time. So if you're planning on traveling to Costa Rica, you should be aware of that. And then you know, at night, the lows are also really quite steady, and it'd be a nice summer temperature in Juneau. So that's sort of the travelogue part of the talk. And now I'd like to talk a little bit more about the research that I did while I was down there with my colleagues. We were specifically looking at the indigenous population and how this boom in tourism is affecting their lives and changing their culture. And I think it's good to have a little bit of a background in what it means, what indigenous means in Costa Rica. It's a very small percentage of the population. There's only about 2.4% of the population is indigenous. That they fall into 8 groups, and here are the 8 groups: the Bribri, the Nobe, the Maleku, the Baruca, the Toraba, the Chorotega, the Cabakar, and the Huetar. And these top 4 are the ones that we visited. So, and they're quite spread out, as you can see from this chart. Just gives you these same in where they're located. So they're not, a lot of times the same indigenous group will be broken up into various areas. So they aren't really in a contiguous land site. Some of them are on their own particular reservations, or as they call them down their territories. These are lands granted to them by the federal government. Some of them are just in city areas or on their own sort of larger pueblo-like areas that function more like a village. And so we visited the Baruca, who were down in this area. They're also along these areas too. This is the Baruca territory. We also visited the Nobe, who are on the Osa Peninsula. This is that almost the entire peninsula is a preserve. We did a tour of the Bribri. We did a medicinal plant tour in this area, and then we visited the Maleku, which are the pink ones. They're up in this area, but we actually visited a village that was more in the central area around the Arenal volcano. So 2.4% of the population of about 4.3 million Costa Ricans. As you can see, there's multiple territories, and one of the biggest problems for them is that the government granted certain territories for their use and for them to live on in perpetuity, but they had a lot of trouble kicking off the people who were already there. So sometimes that went okay, and the people were compensated for that land and they left, and others have remained, and this remains kind of a political flashpoint for certain areas, especially the Maleku, who are living in this area. They have up to 50% non-indigenous living on their land, and they're doing commercial ranching or even banana plantations on land that was given to them. So that becomes quite an issue. So the methodology that we were using in the theoretical framework for our study was we were doing case studies of these 4 indigenous groups, and we were doing observational research as well as interviews. One of my colleagues is fluent in Spanish, so we would have interviews with and here she is. This is Michelle Watson. She was interviewing many of the people that we met and were staying with, and this was all done under university regulations with an internal review board approval. And we had them sign forms that explained all this to them in Spanish before we started. But what we were using too, well, there were limitations. It's very difficult to find any kind of tourism data in Costa Rica beyond very macro look at the economy, like 5% of GDP or whatever. It's hard to break it down per area or even per culture. So there's really no information there that says the indigenous make 10% of their income from tourism or anything like that. So that's a difficult issue when researching in this area. And so we were reading literature from other areas in South America and in Panama, other areas in Central America, where authors have gone in and done similar studies of the indigenous population. And one of the models that we were looking into was by a researcher named Bowman, who was dividing tourism into kind of two ideas, either an inclusionary model where everybody in the indigenous group or in the village can participate in the model and benefit equally, and then the enclave, which kind of as it sounds, is individuals within that group trying to carve out a niche for themselves and provide a service that the tourists will come to and pay them, and that becomes just something that benefits them, which maybe through purchasing in the village or other activities might be expanded to other people. But also there's a lot of competition with that, because if you're offering, let's say, a homestay and your neighbor is offering one too, there's only so many tourists that are going to come and stay, so you may miss out on a few if they have others. So that's one of the issues with that. And what we found is that, or what was found by Bowman and others, is that the state capacity influences what type of tourism these indigenous groups actually choose. So we were looking into whether that was the same situation in Costa Rica, whether there was any input by state agencies into helping develop infrastructure or develop advertisement or marketing for these groups. And we interviewed somebody within the government who was working for the agency that protects indigenous rights, and trying to find out whether there was any kind of cooperation with the indigenous groups for tourism. And as far as we could find, there is no standard or no organized cooperation there. So some of the challenges are that even though, as I mentioned, even though there are laws that protect the indigenous in Costa Rica, they are not well enforced, sometimes just by kind of ignorance or just sort of general lack of enforcement, and sometimes because of the powerful forces that sometimes control certain areas or certain ranches, for example, or banana plantations that are on indigenous territory. They aren't interested in giving up those properties, so they just maintain through their own influence in the government, they maintain their rights to those. The government does have a national tourism board, and they do promote tourism, but they do not promote indigenous tourism or tourism on indigenous lands specifically. So they have sort of lack of a coordinated policy for that. And there's as I'll show in a few slides, there's kind of a brutal lack of infrastructure in some of these places. So naturally, the indigenous people of Costa Rica weren't given the most beautiful prime beach fronts to live on. They were sort of given the land that nobody else wanted anymore. It's a typical story. And so these places are very hard to get to. And in one of them, we if we hadn't had a four-wheel drive vehicle, and even with a four-wheel drive, it was a little bit sketchy crossing certain rivers or creeks. In another one, it's only really accessible during the dry season, and they warn you not to go there in the wet season. So that's definitely a problem when trying to get to some of these places. And also, the one where we did a homestay, I'll show you some slides of that, there was no electricity there. They used solar in very small increments, like battery-powered chargers. So it's limited, the kind of tourism that they'll be able to attract. It's very much off the beaten path, so you have to be a very adventurous person to really go there. So, and as we mentioned, there are several competing ventures in the same territorial area, and sometimes they don't even know about each other, or they're really competing against each other for the same tourist groups to come to visit them. And then we were also concerned about sort of the direct impact of so many tourists coming into the area. What effect will that have on the indigenous tribes themselves and how it's changing their culture? So these were kind of the themes that we were looking into with the research. So the first tour that we did was on the Atlantic side, on the Atlantic coast. I mentioned the Bree tribe. And this area is one of the older tourist areas of Costa Rica. It was accessible from the Caribbean side, so there was a lot of infrastructure built up there. The train, actually, the one and only train tracks that are in Costa Rica go from the capital to the port of Limon, and that's where they take all the fruit and the coffee for export. So people were able to get there. You could fly into San Jose and ride a train to Limon, and from there you go down the coast. Lovely beaches down there, wonderful national parks. That's where I nearly stepped on that snake, was in that area. And so there's been a lot of tourism in that area for a while. And the Bree tribe, they have developed a fairly sophisticated tour that they call their cocoa and medicinal plant tour. So we kind of showed up there in a bus all together and sort of went through and did all the things in this little patch of rainforest that belonged to this one family of this gentleman here. And he was the one that gave this tour, and he explained how they used cocoa. They split open the cocoa pods, and the husks you can use for certain medicinal things like healing cuts on your hand, for example. It's very sticky and sort of forms a protective layer. And then he showed us how to shoot a bow and arrow, and then he actually did something very interesting, which was almost like a magic trick. He had a star fruit. You all know what a star fruit is. So he had this green star fruit, and he gave everybody a chunk of it. He passed it out to everyone, and he told us to eat it. And so, through a translator, so put this in your mouth. So we chewed it up. It was incredibly sour, sour like a lemon. And then he handed out this small bean that's about the size of a coffee bean. It actually looked like kind of a ripe coffee bean. It was red, had a large seed in it. He told us not to swallow it, but to squeeze the seed into our mouths and swish it around our mouths. So we did that, and he said spit it out, so we spit it out. Then he handed us the same, a piece from the same star fruit, and when you put that in your mouth, it was incredibly sweet. It was like candy sweet. And so evidently there's something in this fruit, that's called the miracle fruit, that somehow changes the way your mouth perceives sour and sweet. And so I know that they actually sell that commercially. Somebody told me there's some up in Rainbow Foods that you can get. So I thought that was very interesting. And on this particular tour, we saw nutmeg, we saw cinnamon from a cinnamon bark tree. There was just all kinds of herbs and spices that we would recognize that he showed us on this on his single property. Then we took some of the cocoa pods that we had collected along the way on this tour and cracked them open and we're able to roast them right there on the place over an open fire. So these are cocoa beans that are being roasted up. And then they grind them through a hand grinder, a very laborious grinding of these cocoa beans. And then they encourage us to all take some fresh cocoa in your mouth. And if you've ever done that without putting a lot of sugar and butterfat in it, it's an incredibly bitter. I mean, it makes coffee seem not that bitter. It's incredibly bitter. So it was kind of interesting. But then we mixed it with some sugar and some milk, and we all had a hot chocolate there on the 81-degree day. So that was kind of this idea of mass tourism. It's been going on for a while. The buses come in. The people who sell you the tickets are not indigenous. They're in the town, and they split some sort of profit. We didn't get into what their take on that is, but it's about, I think it costs about $6 a head to go on these tours, and they're getting some percentage of that. So a tour bus would pull up with maybe 30 people in it. So that's sort of how, and you could see from the infrastructure, they kind of live in simple houses there. Many of the houses are government issue, but I did notice they had a flat screen TV when I walked past the house. So it's, they're able to make some money, enough to live on. But again, this is more of the enclave model, because they're the only ones that are benefiting. So it's not really a lot different from if they had a job doing something in sort of the tourist economy. It's about the same. So, and there were other tours that you could go on that were the same sort of medicinal plant tour. So I don't know how we made that choice or how anybody else would make a choice. So the other place that we spent quite a bit of time was with the Baruka. They're inland from where the Bribri are. They're actually over on about the same level, but over on the Pacific side of the country. This is the place where during the rainy season they warn you not to go there unless you have a really, really good car with four-wheel drive. But what we noticed here was that if during the non-rainy season, we were able to get there quite fine with just a normal car. And the village was quite put together quite well. There were, the roads were not paved, but they were graveled. There was a restaurant there. There was a church, a soccer field, a school. And you can see from the sign it says Escuela, which is school, and Museo, which is museum. So it's part of the reason why we wanted to visit there, because I wanted to see what a museum looked like there. So this is their museum. This is a little municipal museum. It's kind of in a traditional, they actually built this traditional house to be part of the museum, to show you what a traditional house looked like. And then they have displays in there, and they have displays inside this part of it. They also give a demonstration of their handicraft making, and they offer homestays in this village where you can actually stay with different people in the village. And then you can see this very large spherical object outside there. That's actually from one of the more ancient cultures in Costa Rica. These spheres are found all over the place, and if you've ever tried to make something spherical, it's actually quite difficult. So there's a lot of debate about what these were used for and how they were made. But they asked to have this one brought there from the National Museum because there were none in that territory, and the National Museum brought that for them. This is what they explained to us. So at this place we did it was a little bit of a tour. It was more of an explanation of how the weaving was done in this area, and it was pretty amazing to watch the weavers take just very simple tree cotton, or they would have commercially spun cotton yarn, and they would just take leaves like this and rub them together, and it would produce this bright blue color that is pretty color fast. And they had different methods for extracting yellow and orange, all from seeds or leaves. And this one I thought was most spectacular because there were the mother of the two, there was mother-daughter team, she just went over to her little garden and pulled off 3 little leaves and rubbed them together with her hands for a really long time and then put them in water and produced this most incredible purple. And being in the museum field and knowing a little bit about how things are dyed, purple is actually a really hard dye to come across. And she was able to produce it just simply from 3 leaves. So I thought that was pretty spectacular. And here's an example of what they weave. You can kind of see the purple dye along here and the yellow and the various dyes. So they weave different, this is the small pouch and sort of more traditional bag, but they also pay attention to current trends. So she explained to me that this is for putting your yoga mat in case you wanted to carry your yoga mat around. And this was for carrying your water bottle around. So they're paying attention to the market and what people wanted to buy. And in the museum, they also offer these masks that are for sale. And I became very intrigued with these masks and started to develop a whole economic theory about these masks and how they contribute to the economy of the Baruca. They are part of their tradition, which is, I think, I'll explain that in a second, but they're really amazing. They're called devil masks, and they're really amazing, colorful. They're quite different from each other, and a mask of this elaborate size and quality will cost about $100, $80 to $100. They're made out of 2 different materials. The unpainted one that you see there is made out of a type of cedar. They called it cedar. I'm not so sure if it's truly related to cedar that we think of in North America, but anyway, they call that cedar. And then these are out of balsa and painted. And it relates to a traditional dance that was done in the village and has been done since Spanish colonial times. And the Baruca were one of the few indigenous tribes to successfully resist the Spanish and remain on their lands and not be pushed off their lands. And they represent this resistance to the colonial conquerors by dressing up somebody as a bull with a bull mask, and then these devils that represent the spirits of the forest come out and attack the bull in a 2 or 3 day ceremony that happens right around the turn of the year. So December 29th through 31st or through 1st is kind of when it happens. And it can get very violent, and they go on an attack, and sometimes the masks get broken. So the masks that are used in that ceremony are the harder wood, and the masks that they sell to tourists are of the softer wood. But they don't really make a distinction between worth or quality. They consider them all a part of this cultural ritual. And I have some examples of how they were carved. They carved them from these balsa wood blanks. And balsa wood grows, as you know, very rapidly in areas with a lot of water. And so they grow down, the Baruca live kind of on a high plain. They grow down on the river, in the river area. So there's a whole market and a whole economy of cutting these trees down and bringing up and selling them. And then there's a kind of a division of labor for the production of the masks. There's a carver who carves them, and they're a little bit lower on the totem pole. And then there's the painter, who is the actual creator of the mask. So there are some mask makers who carve and paint their own masks. And although it's predominantly a male activity, there are women who carve and paint masks, and they're sort of not thought of as any less of a great mask maker than the men. So it's not particularly a man's thing. It just happens to be that more men do it. And I just show this slide. This is one that was for sale from the same 2 ladies who were showing us the weaving. And I just thought this was a particular tour de force of a mask. I mean, it's a pretty incredible from an art historical standpoint, you know, the use of coloration and the balance that they're able to achieve with very simple carving tools. You can start to see, if you remember back on all the pictures of the colorful flowers that I show, you can see the same coloration in this as you see in the butterflies and the hummingbirds and the flowers that are there. So these are really kind of the patterns of their environment, and I just thought they were fantastic. These masks sell everywhere in Costa Rica, regardless of whether you're in Baruca territory or not, and they are copied by other indigenous people who don't have a mask tradition. So I'll get to that at the end, but it's kind of an odd thing that the Baruca masks are so well known that now they're kind of this standard for tourist art. We also went and did a homestay on the Osa Peninsula, way up high, deep in the rainforest, and it was an area that was very difficult to get to, even with a four-wheel drive. And this was the area that had no electricity. They still live in traditional houses there for the most part. There are some government provided housing there, and I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. But they are traditionally living off the land pretty much. They farm what they need. They grow rice, they grow beans, they grow yucca, and they hunt in the forest. So they're living, more or less a subsistence lifestyle. And so we did a homestay, and we actually stayed in this house right here, very simple concrete or cement poured slabs that come together and a metal roof. But we ate in an outdoor kitchen where the food was provided. It was a kind of a very simple fare: rice, beans, some eggs. They had chickens, and then they showed us kind of how they would traditionally do the hulling of the rice. And we went on a tour with the father of the family. He took us on a tour into the rainforest, which was really very lovely, to go deep into the rainforest and not be afraid of anything coming to bite you, because he would show us where all the plants were that we weren't to touch, and then showed us all the plants that they use and they can eat and do different things. So it was a very entertaining tour. He took us to this waterfall, which was quite lovely, fresh water, cool. Once you got deep down into the forest, it cooled off to about 70 degrees. It was really quite lovely. And then the final group that we went to was the Maliku. They're up and around the Arenal volcano area, and they're one of the smallest indigenous groups, and they're the most challenged because they have so many people living on their indigenous territories who are not Maliku. And they're fighting this politically, they're fighting it in the court, they're fighting it on Facebook, and they're actually one of the most sort of social media active groups. As a matter of fact, I asked my co-researcher, I said, what do these two words mean? Is that Spanish, or is it, what is it? And this is in the Maliku language, and it means sort of their tradition. Come and learn about their tradition brought from the forest is the way she translated it. So you can go and do these types of tours with them and have a meal with them as well. And this is the area that they bring tourists, and they talk to them about the different plants, and then they serve them a traditional meal. So they're trying to bring in tour buses, and it's not, I wouldn't say it's super successful. They're about 2 or 3 hours from San Jose at this point, and they're about an hour up a very bumpy road from the Arenal volcano main area where the tourists are. So it's a little bit of an access issue, but they do have these tours that they're offering. They also offer sort of a place to stay, as it were. I hesitate to call it a hotel, but it's sort of an opportunity to stay. It's very simple accommodations, but they sell that, and you can stay on this property there if you want. So back to the social cultural issues. what we found is that tourism, can be a development engine. It can provide money and resources for infrastructure development, but it can also be a destructive force, as we all know. And from the 4 different tribes that we visited, the Bree were more of an enclave model, and the Nobe were definitely an enclave model because they were so isolated, and there was really only one family that was doing it, and they were trying to make the best of it. And they had serious infrastructure problems. And the Maliku is sort of an enclave model. There were direct competition on their area, and they're also in competition with non-natives or non-indigenous who are living on their lands. And then, with the Baruka, I felt like, through our research and what we could observe, they were actually the most successful because their more inclusionary model, they had multiple people making these masks and weaving these textiles, and it was really pervasive throughout their town. And that's just one area of that the Baruka live. There are other Baruka villages, and they all make masks in all of these areas. And so whether that's the actual cause of the more infrastructure and sort of better living standards, we would have to do more research to figure that out. And the Bree were doing pretty well. They had a lot of tourism, but again, it was just affecting certain families that were able to capitalize on it through whatever relationship they had through tour companies. But I just wanted to show you a couple of more images of masks and really drive home the point that the Baruka have really succeeded in using something that is cultural to them. It's a cultural tradition. It has long-standing roots all the way back to the 1600s, and they're what you see everywhere. You see them hanging up in every tourist shop in Costa Rica, and you can't even escape it. When you get to the airport, this is like the last thing in the tourist shop that you see is this giant sign, Baruka masks, and then you see just all these incredibly creative masks that they have. And so on the one hand, it looks like a commodity, it looks like they're sort of mass produced, but in truth, there's a variety to them all. They have the same sort of look, but they're quite unique in a way, and they're made by sort of individual groups of families that are making them, and it seems like more people are benefiting. And then I want to show this mask. This is a mask. I took this picture on the Maliku reservation. So they're starting to copy the Baruka masks, and we asked them specifically, so you guys are making masks too, is this part of your tradition? And they said, oh, no, we don't have any mask tradition in our culture, but they sell really well. So it's what the tourists want, so that's what we're going to make, And they've even made up sort of a whole kind of, mythology about them. Oh, well, this is the jaguar from the forest, and these colors mean this. And, so it's really interesting how it's kind of, transferring to the various tribes. So that's the end of the talk, and I'd be happy to, I think we have a few minutes we can take some questions from the audience, and I'd like to ask you, if you're going to ask a question, if you please step up to the microphone so that we can all hear it in the tape.
How many masks did you come home with?
I actually, I'm not a big mask collector, and I know we have a wonderful mask tradition here in Tlingit country, but I did bring 2 masks home. I just couldn't resist. They just somehow jumped into my luggage. But I wanted to bring that very large mask that I showed you of the lion, and that was about this big, and you have to remember it's made of balsa. So, and we kind of went there early on in the trip, and I was thinking there was no way that thing is going to make it home in one piece. But so does anybody plan on going to Costa Rica anytime in the future? Yeah. When are you going to go? Thursday. Excellent. What part?
Well, we're going to be around the middle. We're going to be around, but we're going to go out to some of the other areas.
Okay. And what city are you going to fly into?
San Jose.
Okay, good. So are you going to go the route where you're going to rent a car, or are you going to be picked up, or?
We're going to get picked up, but we might rent a car for a few days. And how are the roads?
Well, I found, and the roads are getting better, because even from the time, it was funny, we rented a car and the map that the car rental agency gave us was hopelessly out of date. The numbers were all different, and and it wasn't just our mistake. I mean, it's quite simple. There's only so many roads, and they've renamed the roads because they've consolidated a lot of mishmash of roads and made one big road. So what you'll find is that if the roads that you're using are going to touristy areas, like if you're going from San Jose over to the Pacific side, those roads will be quite good. There'll be 2 lanes, but then whenever there's a need to pass, they'll widen out to 3 lanes every now and then. So, and the pavement is really well done. So I think for the most part, I felt like it was the roads seemed to be really well. The biggest problem getting out of San Jose is making the connections to those roads. There's not sort of a logical, like, we're going to the beach on this road all the way. You kind of have to take a really fast road and then get off it for a little while, and then get on another really fast road, and then get off that for a little while. So I think if you're landing in San Jose, being picked up by somebody and taken somewhere is a good option.
Yeah, that's how we're starting.
Yeah, and then from there, once you get your sort of sea legs, as it were, then you'll be able to kind of figure out the road system and everything. But they drive very normal, and it's not like crazy driving. It's just San Jose is just a big city that they never thought would be that big, I guess. So, Jim?
What is being done to assure that the indigenous languages are preserved and that the contact with tourists isn't going to change all that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as you saw on that one sign, the Maliku were using their own indigenous language. Evidently, the Maliku have the most native speakers of their own language. And there's a lot of information about indigenous language in Costa Rica. So that wasn't a particular area of our study, but languages are a very important marker, as we all know, of cultural heritage and heritage development, is how much of the indigenous language survives. So the Maliku and the Nobe were the ones who had the most language survival. And the Nobe are so isolated that while we were there, everybody in the family that we stayed with were speaking Nobe to each other, and they would speak Spanish to us. And then the mother of that family spoke no Spanish at all. So if we asked her a question, it would get translated through one of her sons or something. So the Baruka, however, are very worried about their language loss. And of the villages, the Baruka, as I mentioned, they were kind of semi-accessible. They were, during the dry season, you could easily get there. There were a lot of vehicles there. A lot of the young people that we met, we kept asking them, so what do you do? And they're like, oh, I go to, Buenos Aires is the name of the larger city there. They go there and they're going to school or something. So they're all speaking Spanish and going to school in another city. And the Baruka are particularly worried about losing their language. So they brought in the same way that we have Tlingit immersion here in Juneau, they brought in language immersion aspects to their grade schools. So.
You just mentioned some of the youth. Are there issues with retraining youth in the indigenous areas? Is there out-migration to urban areas, that type of thing, regarding youth populations and next generations? Right.
So we did ask some questions of that. The woman who was showing us the textile demonstration, she was 60 years old. She had 9 children. 8 of them were girls and 1 of them was a boy. And she had 6 grandchildren. And her grandchildren were all going to school. and several of her daughters had gone away to school and were coming back, but none of them, only one of them, I think, lived in the village. So there is a real problem of outmigration. And I felt like the Baruka part of all of this, the selling of these masks and all the money that was coming in, they seemed to be the most sophisticated. Cell phones, a lot of them had cars. They were living in Buenos Aires, which is about an hour away, and driving back to the village. So it is that story of kind of the traditional village, but a lot of people are living in town. That's what's happening. So anyway, we might have time for one more question. One more question.
Okay, I might try to squeeze in two really fast. I was curious why the overall indigenous population was so low. That seemed really surprising to me for a Central American country. And then my other question, when I was there about 2 years ago, I heard a lot about major corporations, Marriott and related, moving into remote areas and how that was having a real impact on these formerly remote communities. I wondered if you heard much about that.
Yeah, so the first question, what was the first question again? Small population. So yeah, 2.4% of the population. So a lot of them were just wiped out. Also there wasn't, Costa Rica didn't have a lot to begin with. So there wasn't a lot of movement back and forth in that area. And the second question about Marriott, we did go to one Marriott resort, but it was in one of the most tourist areas. And I didn't see a lot of non-local motels or hotels anywhere else except for the high tourist areas. So, what I would say is that there aren't any, that many remote areas anymore where they're building a lot of tourist infrastructure. They're really concentrating on the coasts. And the interior is really, quite simple and traditional hotels and things like that there. So,
cruise ships?
Yeah, well, not really. I mean, the Puerto Limon is trying to bring cruise ships in, but the West Coast, the Pacific Coast, I don't think has any.
Well, it's mainly airplanes, right?
Yeah, it's mainly airplanes, yeah. So anyway, thank you very much. I really appreciate you coming.
That was Scott Carrlee in this Juneau World Affairs Council presentation, produced in collaboration with 360 North. It was recorded November 17, 2015 at 360 in Juneau, with support from GCI, Alaska Electric Light and Power Company, Wastman & Associates Incorporated, Coeur Alaska Incorporated, Hecla Greens Creek Mining Company, Sea Alaska, and Alaska Power and Telephone.